Almost more so than any other action cartoon, Teen Titans is very heavily character focused. So many of the show's best moments are so great because they utilize one of the 5 main characters in an interesting or satisfying way. Because of this fact, you would assume that Season 5 Episode 8, Lightspeed, the only one in the series without any of the 5 main Titans, would therefore struggle to tell a captivating story. However, despite this, Lightspeed capitalizes on one of the show's various minimally used antagonists in Jinx, the leader of the High Five, and uses her character to tell a terrifically fun story that still continues to tie into series-long themes, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through all 22 minutes of the only Teen Titans episode without the Teen Titans, and discuss how Jinx's tale of subverting the nature of her powers and finding the light is one of the finest stories that the show ever tells.
Way better than them all. High five, rob 'em blind.
The beginning of this episode actually feels surprisingly like a regular episode of the show, as we open up to a crime being committed in the museum by the new and improved High Five, a scene that would usually be interrupted by Robin coming out of the shadows with a one-liner before we're Titans goad into a fight. But instead, throughout this entire scene, the show plays with this tension by hanging on to certain shots a little bit longer, as the crime remains uninterrupted. Moving through the scene, we get to meet/re-meet the team here, as Kid Wicked, Gizmo, Mammoth, Seymour, and Billy Numerous all get the spotlight for a gag or two. While obviously they can't compete with the Titans, I think they do a good job immediately building some chemistry within this squad, something that continues to get better as they work on it throughout the episode. Of course though, I'm leaving somebody out, the lead of this episode and the leader of the team, Jinx. And spoilers not really for the rest of the video, but she's ultimately what ties this really special episode together, starting with this cold open. From the beginning, it's clear that she was the one who set up this heist for the gang, as she is the only one with a target in the museum, which is a necklace that apparently brings good luck. Something that immediately feels off with the Queen of Misfortune, a fact that she doesn't seem entirely willing to discuss with her teammates. Even though this necklace doesn't end up being a huge part of this episode and is more of a story device, I really appreciate how they begin to weave in details of this episode's themes, as Jinx seems to already be looking for change. Because of this cold open, it ultimately makes it clear that nothing in this episode is the reason that Jinx makes the decision that she does at the end of the episode, as this is something she was thinking about from the jump. Anyway, the rest of the cold open plays out without a fight, right up until a few flashes of light later, and our squad is both completely embarrassed and empty-handed. Well, almost empty-handed, as Jinx is left with a rose, something that's gonna come back later in the episode. The decision to not have a proper fight kick this one off is a really interesting part of the way that this episode chooses to approach having a completely different set of main characters, as it instead wants to focus on characterization first and foremost, something we get more into back at headquarters. Skipping past the intro, wait, we actually can't skip past the intro this time, as we get one of my favorite details in the entire show. Very few things in this world make me as pleased as cartoons altering their intro for special episodes, and I really like how it's handled here, as the High Five shut it down as they proclaim their stake on center stage. Once we get into their headquarters, we do get some more Titans-esque gags with them. And while I do wish that they interacted a little bit more, as everybody's gag is separate, it's still a solid way to meet the cast, while Gizmo and Jinx, the two High Five members that we already know the most about, argue about the guy who busted them. This is where we learn that both Titans East and our titular Jump City Titans are still away, as Jinx reveals her real goal for the episode, and how it ties into the season-long story, as she describes her need for, quote, the Brotherhood of Evil to take them seriously. Besides Jinx just looking for change, as in the necklace, the fundamental reason behind this desire is pretty clearly her need for respect, which comes from a deeper need for purpose. It's a pretty heavy topic for this 22-minute comedic romp to just jump headfirst into, but I think they handle it pretty well, as her 5 teammates, besides perhaps one that we'll get to in a second, don't really care about the Brotherhood of Evil and are perfectly happy with the way that things are, even if their leader is somewhat spiraling. Before that fully happens though, we get perhaps my favorite gag of this entire pretty funny episode, which is the fact that in the same way that the Titans have a crime scanner to look for crime, the High Five have one that gives them opportunities for crime. It's so nonsensical and goofy, and it's just impossible to not love this gag. Anyway, the following crimes in this montage all have a couple of things in common, as they are fun, mostly individual crimes committed by the gang that end with them being embarrassed by our still somewhat of a mystery superhero. While we do get to see a little bit of the gang working together, as Kid Wicket and Seymour take down a literal van of money, the individual nature of this montage does somewhat negate the idea of these scenes showing the group's chemistry. Even if it is fun to watch Gizmo being sent away in a shopping cart and Billy Numerous being shot into a hockey net, especially since the latter's crime is just disrupting a youth sports game and somehow hopefully getting a Zamboni back to their base. The end of this scene fits the rule of 3, or 4, I guess, as our Lightspeed mystery protagonist stops an innocent mammoth from eating his legally obtained Lightspeed bar, as our gang returns back to their base, defeated physically and emotionally. Even if all of the male members of her group are pretty messed up, Jinx only sees this as an opportunity, as capturing some superpowered good doer is exactly the kind of thing she thinks will get the Brotherhood to finally respect their petty crime team. This is where the episode continues to drive in the idea that Jinx has something inherently different inside of her versus the rest of her team, as while she sees this challenge as a chance to do something actually meaningful, everybody else is more or less content with the way that things are, as getting their butts kicked on the regular is pretty standard for them. It's this lack of acceptance that drives Jinx throughout this one, as she goes back to the museum for the necklace and perhaps something else too, as Kid Flash is waiting for her by the time she gets there. There is a lot you could talk about this scene, but what has always stood out to me the most is the voice acting of both characters here. To start with Kid Flash, while DC fans are likely to already know most of the ins and outs of the character, the show still has to tackle the task of introducing him as the completely new hero that he was to a good chunk of viewers. And since this episode really isn't about him, the way they handle portraying his charismatic personality is done through a combination of some stellar writing, some great animation, especially with facial expressions, which are perhaps better in this episode than anywhere else in the show, and most impressively of all, the great voice acting of Michael Rosenbaum, who really brings this character to life from the jump. Equally impressive though is the writing and Lauren Tom's voice acting on the Jinx side of things, as you can really tell as Jinx considers joining Kid Flash before she sees her team and begins to slowly transform her speech into over-the-top theater, essentially mocking the idea of switching sides. This whole scene is one of my favorites from the episode, as we get perhaps the most quiet moment between this episode's main pair, as Jinx almost leaves the dark side right then and there. But before then, she gets and accepts a chance to thrash on our newest character. While it doesn't quite make sense that the High Five followed Jinx there after basically telling her that she's on her own, and Kid Flash fluctuates pretty heavily power-wise for this fight to work and for him to not just bail, the fight still has some really creative and fun shots and choreography. While I do love the Kid Wicket stuff, the clear visual highlight here has to be the Billy Numerous maze, as it's almost sickeningly uncanny and I love every second of it. And while Kid Flash probably should have won this fight, it's easy to get over the power imbalance when you realize that he ultimately falls to none other than Jinx, as the only thing that can cause him to falter and actually lose this fight was a bit of bad luck. While I do fully understand that the high five is made up of 5.5 idiots, the fact that everybody fully acknowledges that Kid Flash got chips from outside his cage somewhat makes it hard to sympathize with Jinx as a character when she just completely forgets about this and just assumes that he can't escape. Either way, we get some more great characterization between Kid Flash and High Five, including the long-awaited questioning of their numerical inconsistency.
If you're called the Hive Five, how come there are 6 of you?
Once the male members of her squad bail, Jinx and her prisoner have a much more interesting conversation, as he continues to draw a line in between her and them, saying that Jinx has something different within her, with the rest of the episode ultimately being about what exactly that is. I really love this moment with Kid Flash suddenly shifting from a joking tone when Jinx mentions actually contacting the Brotherhood, as he begins to desperately try and prevent her from making the somewhat irreversible jump from petty crime to joining an international crime syndicate, a plea that she ultimately only takes as confirmation of her doing the correct thing. Jinx's desire for approval continues as we get the introduction of the real villain of the episode 13 minutes in with Madame Rouge, a character that appears throughout a good chunk of this season, and yet this is by far her best episode in the series. Throughout this one, she is a perfect mix of comedy and actually being menacing, and from the start, she clearly represents who Jinx thinks she wants to be, as Jinx sucks up to her as she gets Rouge to agree to come and pick Kid Flash up, only for that to be his cue to bail. Everybody turning on their leader and basically leaving Jinx to get punked by Madame Rouge after Kid Flash escapes feels a bit off initially, but is ultimately necessary for a plot beat later in the story. Before then though, we get to watch Kid Flash trash the High Five HQ, which makes for a super fun scene. While it does initially seem a bit overly antagonistic, especially since he obviously likes Jinx, but it's implied that this move is to ultimately make it more likely that she chooses to leave her group at the end of this episode, as it's obviously easier to leave if you don't exactly have a functioning home to go back to. Just like every part of this episode, this moment has some really great shots too, with my favorite having to be getting Jinx to destroy her own stuff, as he somewhat forces her to make the decision to move on from her past herself. Anyway, after eventually vibrating his own molecules or something, he bails and sets the stage for Madame Rouge absolutely dunking on her biggest fan. However, instead of shriveling like the rest of her squad, Jinx ultimately stands up to Rouge, simply asking for another opportunity instead of offering excuses, as she fights for any chance to receive the respect and approval of the person she wants the most. Fortunately for Jinx, Madame Rouge never gives her that chance. At this point, Seymour becomes the only member of his team to support Jinx, a decision that pretty clearly comes from a place of unrequited attraction towards her, something that's never expanded on beyond this point, except for perhaps a tiny detail in the finale. Anyway, Rouge using Jinx as a disguise to lure Kid Flash is so insanely unexpected and is an absolute stunner of a tone setter for their brawl, as we easily get the best fight of the episode and one of my favorites from the season. While they do have to slow down our hero a bit for this scene to work, something they somewhat explain through him being tired or something, they still created a ridiculously well choreographed and massively creative fight, as Madame Rouge's quick striking morphs work so well against Kid Flash's litany of speed-based tricks. In general, Rouge just excels at showing what an actual villain is in comparison to the High Five, as she brings her opponent to a point of complete exhaustion, a state that Jinx ultimately stumbles upon him. Watching her use her powers to splash him in order to confirm her identity is one of my favorite quick moments between the pair in this episode, as he ultimately is forced to only use his words to try and get her to make the right decision. As Jinx responds with the clearest showcase of this episode's theme, as he asks her why she wants to be like Madame Rouge in the first place.
I'm bad luck. Good was never an option for me.
Jinx sees membership in the Brotherhood of Evil as the only way to ultimately matter in the world that dealt her the most inherently evil power in the show. A belief that causes her to ultimately still trap Kid Flash and turn him in, as she excitedly tells Rouge the news, only for her to turn around and immediately strike Jinx down, as Rouge correctly assesses the fact that Jinx was only able to trap him because of their fight. And this is the moment where Jinx truly realizes that, in a life of evil, there isn't any true respect or camaraderie, as everybody just looks out for themselves and themselves only. The entirety of Rouge's monologue is so cold, but this moment is what has stuck with me the most after watching it so many times.
Life is full of disappointments. You are one of them.
Ultimately, all of this proves too much for Jinx, as she releases Kid Flash partially just for spite, a move that ultimately proves the only thing to make Rouge see her as a possible recruit, a move that continues to push Jinx out of a life of evil. When Seymour tries to get Jinx to commit one last crime together, she declines, telling him a quiet yet firm goodbye, as she's clearly already made up her mind. A decision made even clearer by the last interaction between her and Kid Flash, as he once again leaves her a rose. Confirmation that his intent from the beginning of the episode has been fulfilled, as she walks into the unknown, her future left a mystery. Except her future is actually not left up to mystery, as good as that would make the final shot of this episode, as even though they don't manage to get Laurenton back, the second to last episode of the series, Titans Together, shows Jinx and Kid Flash team up to take down the Brotherhood of Evil, most chiefly against the rest of her team, who's ironically joined the Brotherhood for this final attack, as well as helping take down Madame Rouge once and for all. Interestingly, Seymour, while he is a part of this fight, isn't actually seen with the rest of his team, as if he perhaps left after the events of Lightspeed. Anyway, back to that episode. What I really think makes this one special, besides what's in the title of this video, is how it tackles one of the biggest themes of the series in a smaller, slightly different way, as Jinx overcomes her inherently evil powers to make a difference the right way. This theme has been done in the series a few times, most notably in Raven's arc throughout Season 4, where she essentially comes to the same conclusion while subverting her divine purpose to destroy the world. As I mentioned before, a good chunk of this episode is about what's different between Jinx and the rest of her teammates, as in what caused Kid Flash to realize she had potential to become heroic. And while I think there is potentially debate to be had on what exactly it is, with one possible option being that Kid Flash was simply romantically motivated, I think what ultimately sets Jinx apart is why she does evil in the first place, which is an innate need for purpose. All Jinx wants to do is, quote, matter in this world, and since her powers are literally bad luck, it makes sense that she would initially see the only path towards this to be evil. Because of something innate within the character, she sees crime as her only path in life, and that she never really had a choice to do anything else. It's a pretty dark theme for this episode to dive into, as you can definitely draw some conclusions about this theme outside of the show's superhero context, as crime isn't exactly exclusive to comic book cities. Anyway, back to Jinx. Despite the fact that she settled down a path towards evil, Jinx still desires mutual respect and camaraderie, something she believes she can obtain as a member of the Brotherhood of Evil. a belief that is ultimately shattered by the cold and uncaring Madame Rouge. The contrast between her and Kid Flash ultimately driving Jinx towards good. Throughout Teen Titans, the idea that the good or the evil inside anybody is a choice rather than something innate permeates throughout almost every character, as every hero and every villain makes decisions that push them towards one side or the other. And by creating an episode without the titular team, Lightspeed, through the story of Jinx, illustrates this idea better than almost anywhere else. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who's here because of all the Fiona and Cake stuff I've been putting out as of late. Don't worry, I still have another video about FNC coming out in about a week, but I knew that I had been neglecting the Teen Titans side of my channel for over 6 months at this point, so I knew I wanted to go ahead and get this one out. If you want to read my horrific and often mocked opinions on animation instead of hearing them, you can check my Twitter in the description. But either way, this has been Apple Samuel, and I can't wait to see you guys in about a week to talk more about Fiona and Cake. Thanks for watching.